Will AI take your job? This is a hot topic right now, and opinions are divided. But the real answer is more nuanced. It might, but how much of it? Before we can answer that question, we need to answer a much more fundamental one. What exactly is your job? Because a job isn't simply the applications you use, the things you type into screens, or your role description. It's everything you actually do to contribute to the business working. And until we understand that properly, how can we possibly decide what AI should replace, what it might be able to replace, and what it probably can't replace successfully at all? Stay with me to the end of this episode, because I'm going to take you inside the actual anatomy of a job, including the applications, institutional knowledge, ways of working, off-system activity, triggers, states, sequences, and decisions that make up the work people really do. And then I'll show you why I think we need to model that work completely and in detail before we decide what AI should do with it. Welcome to the Model Executable Business Systems podcast, the podcast for learning about, discussing, and researching how to turn business models into working business systems. If you're interested in how enterprises can actually model, engineer, and execute the work they do, rather than simply documenting it or banking on AI running everything, you're in the right place. And if you want to continue getting great content on this subject, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, switch on notifications, and click that like button. Now, let's get into it. So, what actually makes up a job? Well, let's take a typical business role and look at what the person actually has to do to make their part of the business work. The first thing we tend to notice is the application interaction. They open an application, navigate to a particular function, enter some information, select some options, perhaps retrieve something, and eventually submit it. And because that's what we can see, it's very tempting to conclude that this is the job. But it isn't. The application is simply one of the mechanisms through which the person performs the work. And even that interaction can be much more complicated than it first appears. A business application isn't necessarily a collection of perfectly separated business functions. A single form might be used to create something in one circumstance, amend it in another, correct it in a third, or initiate an entirely different business activity, depending on what has happened beforehand. The underlying database often has exactly the same characteristic. The same physical structures can contain information produced by many different activities, for many different purposes, and under many different circumstances. So when we observe somebody manipulating an application, we haven't necessarily discovered what business activity they are actually performing. To understand that, we have to look at what the person knows when they perform the action. They know why they're doing it, they know what they're trying to achieve, they know which information matters, which information can be ignored, and which particular way of working is appropriate in this circumstance, and they may know something that isn't represented anywhere in the application at all. Perhaps they've learned, through years of working in the organization, that a particular situation needs to be handled differently from the formal process. Perhaps they know who needs to be involved, who has the authority to make a decision, or who to contact when the system doesn't quite cope with what has actually happened. And this is where a surprising amount of the real work gets done. The person might open a spreadsheet because the application doesn't give them the view they need. They might send an email to somebody in another department, make a phone call, reconcile two pieces of information manually, or simply keep something in their head until the right moment arrives. None of that necessarily appears as part of the formal business process. Yet without it, the work might not get done. And there's another important characteristic of a job that we tend to overlook. A job happens through time. The person doesn't necessarily receive everything they need at the moment the work begins. Something triggers the activity and it enters a particular state. Some information is available while other information is still missing. So the person might do what is appropriate at that point and then wait. Perhaps a customer has to respond. Perhaps another department has to complete something. Perhaps a system elsewhere in the enterprise has to generate some information. And then, sometime later, that information arrives. Now the situation is different. The person doesn't simply see another piece of data. They recognize that the arrival of that information changes the circumstances of the work. They know what it means. they know whether the activity can now progress, and they know what should happen next. Sometimes it follows the expected path, sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, the person draws on everything else they know about the business to decide how to proceed. So the job isn't really a sequence of things the person does to an application, it's an ongoing participation in the execution of the business, where context emerges over time and changes what the person should do next. And this is where I think the question, can AI take my job, becomes much more interesting, because an agent might be perfectly capable of manipulating the corresponding application features. It might be able to call the same APIs, retrieve the same information, and perform the same transactions. But does it understand why that particular action is appropriate now? Does it know what triggered the work, what state it is in, what information is still expected, what has changed since the last action, who has authority, and what the intended outcome actually is? Does it really have the institutional memory and understanding of the activity flow that allows it to mimic what the person actually does? Because if it doesn't, then it isn't really replacing the job. It's replacing some of the application manipulation within the job without really understanding why those particular interactions are taking place, what purpose they serve, or why they are appropriate at that particular point in the execution. And those are very different things. And there is another part of the anatomy of a job that we need to recognize. The person performing it doesn't actually sit in one place in the enterprise. We tend to model people as though they have a role, and that role has relationships to an organization, some capabilities, some applications, and perhaps some processes. But real work doesn't behave like that. Think of matrix management taken to its ultimate endpoint. A person can participate in multiple organizational structures because those structures represent different competencies, levels of authority, and areas of activity. But the same thing happens across the rest of the enterprise. That person can participate in multiple capability structures, multiple application structures, multiple feature and delivery structures, and multiple other hierarchies of purpose, often simultaneously. And those aren't different descriptions of the same thing. They are different structural contexts in which the person participates. One piece of work might bring together one particular role, one particular organizational occurrence, one particular feature activity, and one particular application interaction. Another piece of work, performed by exactly the same person, might bring together a completely different combination. And each combination can lead through different information journeys, different activity sequences, and different behavioral conditions. So the job isn't a static object attached to a person. The job emerges from the collection of execution paths through which that person participates in the enterprise. And that is where the modeling problem becomes much deeper. If we're serious about deciding what AI should, might, or shouldn't replace, we therefore need to model the complete anatomy of the job, not just the application interactions that happen to be visible today. Stay with me, because in the second half of this episode, I'm going to show you what that actually requires, how the work is triggered, how it moves through states and sequences, how information and activity flow through it, how authority and institutional knowledge shape it, and how all of those things combine to produce the outcome the business actually requires. So what would we need from a modeling environment capable of representing that faithfully? Well, I think there are some fairly fundamental capabilities it would need. First, it would need to represent the structural complexity of the enterprise without collapsing it. Organizational structures, capabilities, applications, features, and other areas of concern all have their own distinct purposes and structures, and there can be multiple connected but disjoint occurrences of each. The modeling environment, therefore, needs to preserve those distinctions while still allowing the occurrences to connect wherever the business requires them to. It also needs to understand the different levels of authority, competency, and activity represented by those structures, so that we can establish not simply that something is related to something else, but why that particular structural relationship matters to the work being performed. And because people participate in many of these structures simultaneously, the model needs to represent those intersections without turning them into one giant undifferentiated hierarchy. But structure on its own still isn't enough. Those structures have to become execution. The modeling environment needs to represent the activities that occur within them, the triggers that initiate those activities, the states they move through, the sequences in which they occur, and the information and activity journeys that connect one execution step to another. And this is where the distinction between an application function and a business activity becomes important. A generalized application function, API or MCP tool, may support many different business execution paths. The interface can remain generalized, but the model needs to distinguish the disjoint business paths behind that interface. It therefore needs to connect the particular business activity to the particular applications and information domains that support it, and then make the resulting end-to-end activity flow explicit. But even that isn't enough, because execution doesn't always happen in exactly the same way. The same structural context and underlying activity can behave differently according to the circumstances in which it occurs. A priority can change, a tactic can change, a stimulus can change, a behavioral constraint can apply. An authority condition can determine what happens next. So the modeling environment needs to represent those behavioral and tactical drivers as part of execution, allowing them to modify how an activity proceeds without destroying the underlying structural model. And all of this has to remain connected, not flattened into one graph, and not separated into disconnected architectural repositories. The particular structural occurrence needs to connect to the particular activity, the particular application interaction, the particular information journey, the particular execution step, and the conditions governing that execution. That is what allows us to move from a collection of architectural descriptions to something much closer to the actual execution landscape of the business. And that is what would allow us to model the anatomy of a job faithfully enough to understand which parts of that job are actually being performed, and therefore which parts we might legitimately ask an AI agent to perform safely. And this is where I think the really interesting part begins. Because once we have modeled the enterprise this way, we haven't simply created a more detailed description of the job. We've created something much more useful. We've created an execution map. Imagine going back to our accounts payables clerk. Today, we might tell an agent that it is going to act as an accounts payables clerk. We give it access to the ERP, perhaps some document processing capability, a collection of APIs, some company policies, and a large language model. And then we ask it to get on with the job. What happens next? The agent has to work out what the business expects it to do from all of those fragments. Now imagine the same agent operating against an actual execution model. An invoice arrives. The model establishes where that work has entered the enterprise, what activity has been triggered, and which execution context applies. The agent can see that this isn't simply an invoice. It is an invoice from this particular category of supplier, relating to this particular business purpose, entering this particular organizational context, and therefore following this particular processing path. It knows which information it needs to establish before proceeding, which application capability supports the next activity, and what it is waiting for when that information isn't yet available. So it doesn't have to keep asking itself what the business might mean. It can follow the execution map. Perhaps the purchase order matches, and the next step is straightforward. Perhaps it doesn't. The agent doesn't suddenly have to invent a new business process because something unexpected happened. The model tells it where the exception sits, what authority is relevant, and what alternative path is available. Perhaps the missing information arrives tomorrow. The agent can pick the work up again because the execution hasn't disappeared, simply because the person stopped working on it. The state of the activity, the information that has arrived, and the next applicable part of the journey are already part of the model. And perhaps the circumstances change again. A different supplier category applies. A threshold is crossed. A particular authority is now required. A tactical instruction changes the preferred route. The agent doesn't necessarily have to infer all of that from historical examples and hope it gets the answer right. The model changes the execution context in which it is operating. And that is a rather profound difference. We have traditionally asked AI to look at the evidence left behind by the business and infer what the business probably wants. Here, we're doing almost the opposite. We're giving the agent a representation of how the business actually works and asking it to operate within that representation. The agent still has intelligence. It may still need to interpret something, resolve an ambiguity, or make a genuine inference. But it isn't being asked to reconstruct the entire business every time it encounters a new situation. It knows where it is in the execution. It knows what brought it there. It knows what information is relevant. It knows what capabilities are available. And importantly, it knows what the model says should happen next. So instead of an agent wandering around the enterprise with a bag of tools, trying to work out what those tools mean from whatever information it can retrieve, we have something much closer to an agent following a map. And that map doesn't just show where the agent can go, it shows why it is there, where it came from, what it is trying to achieve, and what governs the journey from here. That, I think, is where agentic architecture starts to become genuinely interesting. Because we're no longer trying to make the agent intelligent enough to discover the business. We're making the business explicit enough for the agent to execute within it. And that changes the question from how intelligent does the agent need to be to something much more useful. How complete is the execution model we're giving it? So, will AI take your job? Well, not if all we give it is the context we currently give it. With today's enterprise architecture, an agent can largely learn to mimic the footprint of how you interact with the existing IT estate. It can learn which applications you use, which functions you invoke, which data you retrieve, and which APIs match the screens you interact with. But even that is usually an approximation, because those interfaces are themselves functionally overloaded. The same application function, API or tool, can support many different business activities and execution paths. So the agent can mimic the observable footprint of the job without necessarily understanding the job itself. But give it the right execution model, and the proposition changes completely. Now, the agent doesn't have to reconstruct the business from the traces left behind by previous human activity. It can follow the map. It can participate in the actual execution path, understand the structural context in which it is operating, follow the information and activity journeys, respond to the state of the work, and apply the behavioral and tactical conditions that govern what happens next. And that means the question is no longer whether an AI agent is clever enough to replace a person. The question becomes whether we have modeled the work well enough for an agent to perform it faithfully. Because perhaps the real limitation isn't AI's ability to do our jobs. Perhaps it is the fact that we've never properly modeled what those jobs actually are. And that brings us back to where we started. Before we ask AI to replace the job, we need to understand the job. Not the job title, not the application footprint, not the database records it leaves behind. The execution. And once we can model that completely, we can finally decide what should be done by people, what should be deterministic software, where genuine inference is useful, and where an AI agent actually belongs. That's the real opportunity. Not AI replacing the job, AI participating in an accurately modeled business system. And that, I think, is a much more interesting future. So keep calm and complete the model.